Are you looking for a gift for a wedding, an anniversary, a baptism, confirmation, or even a birthday? Look no further than Mediatrix Heirloom Rosaries. Not only are these lovely rosaries made out of the finest materials, including Venetian glass beads, Austrian crystals, and precious and semi-precious stones, but during the creation of each rosary, the founder, Jeanette, prays for the intention of the person that it truly belongs to. Click on the link above or below in our description to learn more about Jeanette's story and to see the lovely collection of her heirloom rosaries today. To be the person God created you to be, you'll need a solid physical, mental, and spiritual foundation, and Pietra Fitness can help. Pietra Fitness is a uniquely Catholic fitness program, offers in-person and online classes that combine stretching and strengthening exercises with Catholic meditation. Whether you've been working out for years or you're looking to build a fitness habit, Pietra Fitness has a class for you. You can access their unlimited on-demand workouts by signing up to their online studio. Click the link above or below in the description to start your free trial today. Hello and welcome back to A Reason for Hope. I'm Mario Costabile and thanks for tuning in. How are you doing today? We have a great podcast for you. Our Director of Theology, Dr. David Hajduk, will be interviewing well-known Catholic speaker Jason Evert. We will be breaching on a subject that is a bit touchy these days, gender ideology. I mean, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? And more importantly, how do we minister to people who are struggling in these areas? I'm very interested in this topic myself. A Reason for Hope podcast is growing and reaching more and more people, and I'm happy that you're listening to us today. We hope that this podcast has helped you in your faith walk. If it's brought you closer to God, share it with someone you care about. The more people that hear it, the more people that can be healed. We're available on all podcast platforms. Let's bring as many people to the Lord as possible. Let's make disciples of all nations. And hit and like the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Also, please prayerfully consider going to our donation page and supporting this work. Without people like you, we would not exist. All you have to do is go to our website at arrayofhope.org and navigate to our donation page. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, so any and all donations are tax deductible. As I share with you, our guest today is Jason Evert. And here's our interview with Dr. David Hajduk and Jason. So welcome, Jason Evert. So good to be with you today. Thank you for coming on A Reason for Hope.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. So you're the founder of the Chastity Project with your wife, Crystalina, and arguably one of the most sought after speakers on topics related to God's plan for love, relationships, and sex. You know, you're the author of many books and programs like the Theology of the Body for Teens and You, both produced by Ascension Press. Fantastic programs, fantastic resources. So I guess a great place to start is, how did all that happen? Like, you know, how do you go to realizing this is what the Lord is calling me to do, and then, you know, having it blow up effectively where people are just so desiring you to come in and share this message and all that. So why don't you share that? That'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, thanks be to God, we are at a point now where we're talking to almost 100,000 kids a year. We've written 20 books, but it wasn't so much of an explosion as it was kind of an organic growth. Started back in college. I was leading high school retreats, and the kids are really opening up to me about the struggles they were having with dating, relationships, sexuality, family issues. And I realized they just had no formation when it came to human love. At the same time, I did 3 years of sidewalk counseling as a college student, talking to women right before their abortion appointments, trying to give them different alternatives. And I just started feeling late. Like, why am I meeting this woman who's having an abortion in 45 minutes? Like, why couldn't I have met her when she was 15 years old? Because maybe if she learned about chastity then, she wouldn't have dated this guy in the first place and be in this difficult situation today. I felt like I was kind of throwing sandbags on the banks of a flooded river when there's a dam that's broken a quarter mile upstream, and that everybody's focusing on the supply of abortion, legislation, and activism, but nobody's really talking about the demand for abortion, which is unchastity. And so while I was leading these high school retreats, doing the pro-life work, I also discovered St. John Paul II's book, Love and Responsibility. And reading that in college to me, I was like, well, this is the antidote. Like, this is the answer to so much of this hurt and confusion. And so started speaking at the local high schools, youth groups, and, one thing led to another, and it just gradually snowballed, to where we are speaking to more than 2 million teens in person 26 years later.
Well, that book, Love and Responsibility, was also very formative for me. And I'm wondering, what were the messages that really struck you? I mean, I think for myself in that book that the contrast between loving and using was a really powerful message that I got. I had never thought about using as the opposite of loving. Yeah. And yet when I share that with people, it has a profound impact on them. What were some of the themes that you thought were particularly helpful and effective as you talk to people about relationships?
Two or three in particular that jump out. One is that when he said chastity, the word needs to be rehabilitated. And so a lot of people just want to avoid the word, but that's not his approach. We need to rehabilitate it. It's a beautiful word. We should love chastity. It's not some list of, prudish prohibitions, this Victorian negative idea of sexuality. It's that virtue that frees us to love, frees us to know if we're authentically being loved. And so I like how he goes after that word of chastity and says, no, we're keeping this. This is a beautiful gift. We've got to promote it. But then he also said that chastity can only be thought of in association with the virtue of love. That if we don't make that connection firm in people's minds, then scaring them with pregnancy rates and STD, like that's not going to motivate people to be virtuous and pure. But it's that virtue that frees you to love, frees you to know that you're being loved. Also, his treatment of the subject of modesty, explaining that it's really the guardian of love. It opens up a way towards love, that he has such a beautiful view of the human person and human sexuality. I found that it just transcends even religious boundaries, where I can use his messages in public high schools. And the kids don't know I'm doing it, but I'm giving them love and responsibility. I mean, we even put in the book one of his quotes from there, but in the public school book, we just say, one guy said, and then we've got the quote. So he's going to give me a hard time about that in heaven. He's like, one guy, really? But he speaks so much to the human heart from his personalistic approach that it really resonates, not as some like exterior arbitrary authority that you have to conform to, but what is it that you really long for? And are you finding it in the way that you're living? And so he has a beautiful way to kind of disarm some of our defenses we have when it comes to this topic of human sexuality.
Right. And especially since so many people, when they look at the church and they look at the church's teaching, immediately think that like what the church is saying is a big no to sex, right? Or to be down on sex. Where I think in Love and Responsibility, when John Paul says the chastity is not predominantly a no word, it's a great yes to God's plan that has no's as a consequence, but it's fundamentally a yes, so that is a real positive message. And it's one that I think it still resonates with people today. Far too few know it. So thanks for sharing that. In recent years, you've turned to focus a lot on the topic of gender. You've wrote this incredible book, Male, Female, Other, which I recommend highly. Read through the book. It's filled with highlights and underlines. So it's a really wonderful guide for people, I think, who maybe are just, kind of thrown into confusion about the current discussions around these issues. I guess I'm wondering, not that you're not talking about chastity anymore, and not that this isn't sort of naturally connected, because certainly talking about the theology of the body, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Were things that were always part of that message. Why did you turn to focus so much on this? And what is it that called you or led you to do that?
Well, each of the resources we've created over the last couple of decades, they say that necessity is the mother of invention. And so there were times where I felt a decade or two ago, wow, there really isn't a good short book on chastity that we could give to kids wrestling with this particular aspect. Oh, well, pornography, when we need a resource for that. Well, what about for the girls struggling? Oh, we need a resource for that. So each one we've come up with, we're trying to follow in what the need is for the culture at that time. And I'd be traveling to these high schools and parishes and talking to the schools, meeting these parents. My daughter identifies as non-binary. She wants to have top surgery. What do I do? And I'd say, well, here's a website and here's a blog and here's some video and book. And, but I just felt like I was hodgepodging the resources. And I thought, I think what the church really needs right now is a book that is going to be really in depth on this, that can answer questions, whether you're an educator, a parent, or a college student in some gender studies class, or some teenager wrestling with gender dysphoria, that we could just give them all the same resource and say, this will answer your questions with clarity and the same time as charity. So I really wanted to set that pastoral tone of how to approach this subject, because a lot of Catholics, when they hear gender theory, all this non-binary, gender fluid, trans woman nonsense, you're either XX or XY, that's all there is to it. Kind of this dismissive, debating attitude. And for those on the receiving end of that, they feel kind of erased, they feel attacked. And so what I wanted to do with the book is try to set the tone for how can we speak into this sensitive subject with plenty of clarity, but then lots of charity at the same time.
I want to tell you more about our sponsor, Mediatrix Heirloom Rosaries. Mediatrix is the term that refers to the intercessory role of the Blessed Mother as a mediator in the salvific redemption of her Son Jesus, who generously bestows graces through her. These graces are incredibly accessible through praying the rosary. Jeanette, the founder, was moved to develop her unique style of rosary design after a personal miracle of healing through the intercession of the Blessed Mother. She has been making these stunning heirloom rosaries since 2010 to honor the Blessed Mother and to share the devotion of praying the rosary with as many people as possible. Claire O'Reilly said, "The rosary that I bought from this young lady was exquisite, so much so that it led me to buy several more. As you can see, each one is unique and irreplaceable, just like the people we plan to gift them to. I highly recommend her work. It's pure beauty and even more breathtaking in person." Click on the link above or below in our description to order your set today. These handmade heirloom rosaries will be treasured for a lifetime of devoted prayer. You were made for greatness, but to become the person that God created you to be, you'll need to have a solid physical, mental, and spiritual foundation, and Pietra Fitness can help you build it. Pietra Fitness is a uniquely Catholic fitness program that offers in-person and online classes combining stretching and strengthening exercises with Catholic meditation, bringing life and health to the whole person. Pietra Fitness has workouts to help you improve your posture, balance, flexibility, and core strength, reduce stress, and increase spinal and joint mobility, all while nourishing the soul with prayer. Whatever your personal needs, goals, or fitness levels, they have a class for you in their online studio. Pietra Fitness even offers chair classes, prenatal and postnatal classes for new moms, and their new Pietra Kids programs will help the kids get their bodies moving, find peace in an increasingly stressful world, and fall in love with their faith. Click on the link above or below in the description to start your free trial today.
So your book, Male, Female, Other, A Catholic Guide to Understanding Gender, is, as I said before, just a tremendous resource. I think it strikes all the right notes. You mentioned the pastoral tone, which is key, but you go from clarifying the basic concepts and terms for people, which is so important because there's so many, obviously, to making sense of the scientific research, which is often misrepresented by proponents of gender ideology and so-called gender-affirming care, and to understanding even the philosophical roots of gender theory and ideology, as well as digging into the church's teaching about the human person and the human body. It really is a fantastic compilation of all the important information, I think. Obviously, you could go deeper into any chapter of it, but it lays it all out in a really clear way. And in fact, the structure itself really struck me because you were deliberate in how you approached structuring the book. You want to talk a little bit about that? Why you structured the book the way you did? Because I think it's a really powerful approach.
Yeah, when I started writing it, I figured, okay, I've had enough conversations with young people who have gender dysphoria, their parents. I've, read up plenty on the subject. Maybe I'll read 10 or 15 more books on it, and then I'll, have a good solid base on which to write the book. And I finished those 10 or 15 books. And I'm like, I'm not even close. I need to read 5 more books on endocrinology, 5 more on pediatric medicine, 5 more on psychology, 5 more on Marxism, on feminism, on gender theory, on theology. Because when we're addressing the subject of the human person, which is ultimately a mystery, all of this has to be buttoned up because you can't really address the subject of gender if you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, comorbidities of different psychological issues that could be at play, the spiritual element, anthropology, the philosophies behind this. So to me, it's probably been the most research I put into one book. When it was all said and done, there's more than 1,000 references in the endnotes that you'll see in the end. And so we start with kind of the subject, okay, like what is gender? Like what does this word even mean? What are these emerging gender identities? What is all that stuff about? We kind of tackle like the scientific objection. Okay, is there such a thing as the trans brain? What about people who have intersex conditions? Kind of tackling some of those things, then diving into the whole subject of transitioning, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, the surgery, the regret, the high suicide rate afterwards. And then going into the cultural things. What about prisons and bathrooms and sports teams and all that jazz? And then questions, okay, my kid says they're trans. What do I do? Or, hey, I have experienced gender dysphoria. What does God think about me? And so we kind of end on that. So we really try to cover the full gamut of questions people might have on the subject.
Now, you approached it in a way analogous to like Aquinas with the Suma, where you're actually posing the opposite position, you could say, of what the church's position would be or what the actual truth of the matter might be. But you're trying to present it in the most positive light and with the strongest possible argument, like Thomas would do in the Suma. So can you talk to that and why you approach things that way?
Yeah, we didn't want to set up a bunch of straw man arguments that when someone reads it, they'd be like, what? That's total mischaracterization of our position. We wouldn't even say that. That isn't even the latest research on this. You're totally building up a straw man and knocking it down. Right. We wanted to really portray it as fairly and accurately as possible. So that way a person could read that kind of introductory paragraph of each chapter and be like, yeah, that's exactly what we believe. And that's why we believe it. Now, what do you have to say about it? And then we spend the rest of the chapter kind of affirming what could be true in some of those points, but then fleshing it out to why it kind of misses the big picture. And so we really wanted to fairly characterize, and represent their position. But in the same respect, when I finished the book, I sent it to experts in all the different fields of pediatric medicine, of philosophy, of theology, public policy, this and that. And then I even sent it to 2 Catholics who identify as trans. And I asked them, hey, would you read this manuscript and give me your feedback? How is this landing on your heart? And am I representing this fairly? And they gave back literally hundreds of editorial suggestions and changes. Like, no, that's not what we think. You got to word it this way. No, you could nuance that more carefully. And so I really appreciated the fact that they took the time to go through the manuscript so that when they would read it, it'd be like, yeah, I might not agree with all the Catholic points on this, but at least I feel like it represents us fairly.
Well, let's dig in a little bit to the text. And maybe a good place to start is the actual word gender itself. This is interesting because looking historically at how the word has shifted from us using the term sex to refer to being male or female to using the term gender is itself interesting, and how that's related to probably one of the first, if not certainly one of the first in the long cast of characters in gender theory, Dr. John Money. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the word gender, how we've come to think of gender the way we do, and how John Money was involved in that.
Yeah, one of the reasons why the word gender is particularly unhelpful in these dialogues is because it means so many different things to so many different people. Originally, the word came from a Greek root meaning the manner in which one generates. And that's pretty black and white, right? I mean, there's only 2 gametes. It's either a sperm or an egg. That's it. There's no spectrum of gametes. It's clearly one or clearly the other. That's it. And so that was the origination of the word. It first emerges in the English language in about the 14th, 15th century. And that it's more in reference to the grammar of language, that noun is masculine, feminine, neuter, or whatever. And that's predominantly what it was throughout English language through history. In about the 15th century, we do see it used as a synonym for biological sex, but it was still predominantly used as more of a grammatical term. In the 1950s, 1955 is the first time we see it used in the term of gender roles by Dr. John Money, who was a psychologist, a child molester, an extremely broken individual. And he's the one who really started to divorce, not simply distinguish, but divorce gender from human sexuality. And from there, the feminist really played into some of his psychological theories. And then we had this idea not just of gender roles, which are social behaviors, but of gender identities and then different genders. But even today, it's like, okay, you have a gender reveal party. Okay, am I revealing the internal sense of gender identity of my kid? No, we're talking about their biological sex. When you fill out some government application, what's your gender? It's asking for biology. But then you go to a college orientation, it's like, what's your gender? Here's the list of 18 of them. It's like, well, wait a minute. Now we're talking about these perceived gender identities. And so I think it's really important we have a discussion on this. Like, what are we talking about here? And from a Catholic perspective, it's easier and more accurate to speak of one's sexual identity than it is of gender, because that doesn't divorce this internal sense of self from the biological reality of who we are as men and women.
Excellent. And we're going to come back to that question because a lot of this does come back to an adequate anthropology and an integral vision of the human person, right? So we'll get to that a little bit later on, but maybe you could delve a little bit deeper because there's a little bit of a medical history here. You've got Magnus Hirschfeld, right? Mm-hmm. You've got Harry Benjamin, who's somewhat connected to Kinsey, right? And so many people might be familiar with Alfred Kinsey and the Kinsey Report. And then you've got John Money. And of course, Kinsey himself was riddled with scandal and a very disturbing individual. And yet, though Kinsey and Money's research has pretty much been like debunked, they're still the source of so much of what people are holding and putting forth today and what's taught even in gender studies programs. So maybe you could just give us a little brief overview, because I think this is important for people to hear that this is a whole movement that's been happening for quite a while. So
a quick flyby of the kind of the pivotal players you mentioned. Magnus Hirschfeld was a guy in Germany in the 1920s, 30s, 40s who started this kind of sexual museum out there. And he was the one who first started performing these sex change operations on people, castrations. He tried to transplant testes into men to cure them of homosexuality. Just a really macabre set of ideas that this guy had at play. And so he, though, was hailed by this guy, Harry Benjamin, as this Einstein of sex. And so Benjamin flies him out the United States for a whole tour of academia, universities, medical professionals, hailing this guy as kind of this pioneer. Now, Harry Benjamin is the guy who ended up being the one who started the Harry Benjamin Foundation, which became WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And this is now what's considered like the gold standard of care for trans individuals who identify as trans. Harry Benjamin was the guy who kind of started that whole thing. Now, he ended up connecting with a guy, Dr. John Money. Now, Dr. John Money was a guy who was abused by his own dad. His father passed away when he was still young, raised by, I believe, his mom and their spinster aunts, and in a really dysfunctional environment. Even as a younger person, he said he wondered if it would be better if men as well as farm animals were castrated at birth. And so this was this guy's own psychology. Now, he's not a medical doctor. He was a psychologist. And he had an idea that, he was very interested in children that were born with ambiguous genitalia. And he had the perfect opportunity to kind of test his theory that gender is a social construct when he came in touch with a young married couple who had twins, Bruce and Brian Reimer, and one of them had a botched circumcision that resulted in the loss of the boy's genitals. And the parents came to this doctor distressed, and he said, look, there's totally a way to sort this thing out. We'll get a castration completely. And then we're just going to raise Bruce as Brenda. Okay. And so we'll just tell this child that they're a girl and they're not going to know the difference, and because it's all cultural conditioning. And it ended up being a complete, as you could imagine, dumpster fire. I mean, when they gave little Brenda a sewing machine as a little girl, she just took the thing apart because she wanted to know how it could work. They gave her a little jump rope to play with, and she said this is only good for whipping people and tying them up. She would get on fights, and people were like, well, what's wrong with this girl? It's because she wasn't a girl, and he knew that he was not this person, and he couldn't figure out what was wrong. The parents would bring Bruce and the brother Brian to Dr. John Money every single year, because he said it was very important that, we help coach them through their appropriate gender roles. And you'll see they'll just grow up and be just wonderfully fit in as male and woman. But he ended up molesting the kids during these things, taking child pornography. I mean, it was so heartbreaking. And poor child Bruce went to these meetings thinking his parents knew these things were happening and they must know that this will be good for me. Otherwise, why would they let this happen? Parents had no idea this was going on behind closed doors. And eventually it came to the point where Bruce just had a mental breakdown and they wanted to have more surgeries on him. And eventually the dad was able to tell him the truth. And he just wanted to know, what was my name? And, they told him Bruce, and they ended up changing his name to David, who slayed Goliath, and ended up on the Oprah Winfrey show, sharing his own testimony. And that caused all these other kids to come forward to say, hey, John Money did that to me too. And so the Johns Hopkins gender department there ended up being shut down as a result of all of this from Dr. Paul McHugh, who actually cared about the research and the kids, not his own agenda. So that kind of went underground for a while and then was recreated in the 2000s and started back up. And so that's a little flyby of Dr. John Money, a very broken individual who basically transferred his own brokenness into young people. But then he went on basically a lecture tour of academia in America saying, look at this perfect example. You've got Bruce and now Brenda, and she's just doing perfectly well. And no one would ever know that she's not a girl. And she's fully convinced she's a girl too. And look how great this is. Meanwhile, the entire family was falling to pieces: drug addiction, infidelity, alcoholism. Bruce ended up committing suicide. His brother died of a drug overdose. I mean, the whole story from beginning to end is absolutely tragic when we deny the reality that God made us male and female.
And you mentioned before how John Money's research was used by those who were philosophically and politically pushing the sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. I think this is also an important topic to talk about, at least in a bird's eye view, so people can understand that there's this evolution of thought, this way in which this has been coming for a long time. Carl Trueman, I don't know if you're familiar with Carl Trueman, his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is just an excellent book, I think, fantastic for people. He starts that book by asking a question: how have we come to the point where the statement, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, would even be intelligible to people, let alone accepted as a de facto thing by anybody simply by having stated it, And so he offers many insights in that book. And I think that you could even add more to it. So your research and your book touches on this too. So, I mean, this brings in a whole nother cast of characters. You could go from Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx to Reich and Marcuse and de Beauvoir and Firestone and Butler. Yeah. So maybe you can hit some key points you think are important to share so people can kind of get this idea of how this ideology moves and grows.
Yeah, an analogy that I use in the book that I think is helpful in terms of, okay, where is this all coming from? It's a big question. It's like asking, okay, well, where did this flood come from? Well, why is the river flooding? Well, you could have, the ice caps on the mountain are melting. You could have a torrential downpour of rain. Maybe there's underground springs that have burst forth. There could be so many different sources leading to this. And I think it's the same thing right now with this. We've got obviously the medical aspect of it and the money that's behind that. I know one woman who had detransitioned. She said she just looked at her medical bills during the transition process, and it was over $1 million that insurance had to pay out for all the different changes that she made. And that's one individual alone. Now you globalize that and you can look at the billions that are coming in. So you could look at the financial, medical aspect of it. You could look at the philosophical, at Marxism, of this dialectic idea of male and female kind of being these polar opposites, this diametrical force that you need to, if we're going to really liberate women from oppression, we basically have to eliminate sexual distinction. And then they're truly going to have this sexual liberation. So there's a philosophical strain. You look at women's gender studies, gender theory, in particular, people like Judith Butler. And in her book, Gender Trouble, she says a line in there that really struck me. I mean, her writing is very difficult to read and to wade through, but she said that, sexual practice has the power to destabilize gender. And you got to sit on that for a while. Sexual practice has the power to destabilize gender. Now let's look at that through the lens of things like contraception and same-sex marriage. What we had through contraception was essentially what was going on is we had the capacity now to act against our sexual nature in such a way that basically blurs a distinction between man and women. Because what happened is what we did with birth control was give women the reproductive rates of a man, that she could engage in a sexual act and basically not have any responsibility afterwards. And so we're blurring the sexual distinction there by acting against our own bodies. And you see that contraception came first. What flowed from that is, well, if a man and a woman can engage in an act that's not intrinsically ordered towards procreation, then how come a man and a man can't engage in a sexual act that's not intrinsically ordered towards procreation? And so you can see how contraception paved the way for same-sex marriage, but then same-sex marriage further blurred the importance of the distinction between male and female, and then the transgender movement happened after that. It's not a coincidence that they happen in this exact order. There's a very logical flow between how those dominoes fell down.
Now, I'm going to share with you two quotes that I think are pretty profound, and then I'm going to ask a question related to the church's response to this. Okay, so, and it's going to tie, I think, all this together. Archbishop Chaput, Archbishop Emeritus of Philadelphia, stated, "The most difficult problems facing the church today are not matters of ecclesial structure and process. They're tied intimately to Psalm 8 and to the question of who and what a human being really is. Do humans have a created nature? Are our bodies merely the disposable instruments of our appetites and will?" So that's Archbishop Chaput. And then Carl Trueman, who I mentioned before, wrote that book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He wrote an article in First Things, and he said this: "As the 4th century wrestled with the doctrine of God, the 5th century with Christology and the nature of God's grace, and the Reformation era with the sacraments and salvation, so our age wrestles with the question of anthropology. What does it mean to be human? More specifically, what does it mean to be an embodied human? For now we find ourselves not so much in a battle for the Bible, but in a battle for the body."
Yeah.
So I think these insights are fundamental insights that John Paul II made many, many years ago. And so maybe you can share some of the insights of John Paul II's teaching on what it means to be a human being. What is that adequate anthropology? What is the meaning of the human body? Because it's really this splitting apart of the person that is at the root, I think, of so much of what we're confused about today in our culture. So,
yeah, I think the Holy Spirit always knows what the church needs well before the church needs it. And that's why I think the Holy Spirit was inspiring John Paul II to be writing these things in the 1970s, penning these thoughts, then finally putting them out late 1970s, early 1980s, and then here we are 40 years later, finally starting to really unpack the wisdom that he gave us in the theology of the body. I mean, how prophetic to write a book, male and female, he created them, long before this issue was even on the radar. And so we've got the answer before us that the human person, the human body, is the only creation of God that makes a person visible. So animals have a body, but they're not a personal being. Angels are personal beings, but they don't have a body. And so the human body alone in creation makes a person visible. And so it's not that you have a body like you have a pair of jeans. Your body is you. If you say, I'm going to the store, well, I'm willing to bet your body is going to the store as well, because it is who you are. And so the question really boils down to, is my body meaningless or is my body meaningful? And so I've heard of some individuals in the trans community talking about, well, if gender is tied to sex, then we are slaves to our bodies. And it's like, whoa, I mean, you start to you spend some time marinating on that thought of being enslaved by your own body. It's this dualistic split of I'm not my body. I'm something other than my body. And so if I don't feel at home in my body, my feelings are not the problem. Okay, the body is the problem. And so especially when young people are wrestling with issues of mental health, whether it be anxiety, depression, autism, some of these comorbid factors that often tie into gender, it's difficult to fight those things. You might feel like you're shadow boxing. Am I making any progress? How am I healing? Is this even working? I don't even like myself. And it's so tempting at these moments to make the body a false target of intervention, that it becomes the target of all of your angst. Maybe the question is, I don't like me. It's a lot easier to say, well, I don't like my body. And so I can make changes to my body. I can fix my body. I can cut that off. I can add this. I can morph this with hormones. And then you feel like you're kind of getting somewhere and you're doing something about something. But then when the end of the train comes and you've gone through all the puberty blockers and hormones and surgeries, and it's all the dust settles, the problems are still there. And now they have new ones as well. And so what begins in the halls of academia and these philosophers, it does not stay there. This bleeds out and fills the culture with this fog that we're living in, and we don't even realize that we're part of it. And so Truman's work, I think, is so important in kind of stringing all those pieces together philosophically of where did we get to the point where we are now, where, as you said, that statement that I'm a woman trapped in a man's body is even intelligible.
Right. Excellent. And you write this great line in your book where you say, what if young people are being culturally conditioned to believe that their gender can be divorced from their body? What if gender theory is the social construct after all? Because so often you hear that gender is just a social construct. And yet the default position is if there's a conflict between what I feel I am on the inside and my body, it's the body that's the problem, right? Yeah. And I think that's the point that you're making. And yet that's a presumption that you're making based on a whole anthropology and a way of seeing the human person and yourself that is, like, let's say 10 steps before the issue that you're dealing with. And yet people don't even translate sometimes that they're running with a view of the human person that they have assumed is true, that has been passed on to them culturally, that may not be true, right?
Yeah. And so, I think, when you hear these statements, well, gender is a social construct, I think, okay, let's pause there and let's pull out of that what's true, that gender in the sense of our gender roles can be culturally impacted. That certain cultures, women typically do this and guys typically do that. You go on the other side of the world, it might be a little different. So there are nurturing impacts, not just nature impacts to our behavior. But what studies show, which is really interesting, is in the most egalitarian of nations where women are given freedom to do whatever they want and men are free to do whatever the heck they want, they typically pile back into these stereotypical roles. It's like where they just gravitate towards. I mean, we had an electrician at our house yesterday because there's a problem in the circuit breaker in the garage. And guess what? It was 2 male electricians who came. Was I surprised that it wasn't 2 women? Nope, because 99% of electricians are men. I dropped my kid off at preschool. Where are all the male teachers? They're not there. Is it because they're doing some profiling and not letting the men teach the preschool kids? It's like, no, they frankly don't have an interest. It's the women that love that task more than the men. And so these aren't cultural impositions. These are simply the fact that we are different in the way that I think, the way that our brains work. And so it's okay if we naturally gravitate towards these things. So I think it's important when you hear stuff like gender is a social construct, okay, let's affirm what's true in that. But then broaden our lens to realize, okay, maybe it's not all nature or all nurture. Maybe it's a blend of both.
Right. It's not merely a social construct, right? And I think that would be the typical position, I think, being put forth. It's merely a social construct, which I think is a good point. And by the way, maybe this is a little premature, but one of the things that I know you talk about a lot and I find very interesting is that sometimes through putting forth a very strict idea of what masculinity looks like or what femininity looks like, that we could do a disservice to people because there's not enough room for them to move. I think, like, for example, is there room for a tomboy girl anymore? Like, is there room for a guy who's artsy and doesn't want to use power tools? The fact of the matter is, I don't know how much room there is for that anymore. And is that part of what is confusing for young people?
Yeah, and I think the reaction we're seeing of the rejection of sexual difference is an understandable response to these overly rigid gender stereotypes, that if you're a real man, you better fit into this mold. If you're a real woman, you got to conform to Barbie and Instagram and all that other stuff. And plenty of young people are like, okay, that's not me. And I don't want to be that. I can't be that. And so maybe it's because I'm not truly a woman. And so I would call this like a stereotype-induced anxiety, that they spend so much time on social media of these expectations of what a woman should be. And there's this chasm between what they think a woman is and what they are as this kind of unsteady 14-year-old girl. And kind of Abigail Schreier, who wrote a great book on this, said bridging that chasm feels just helpless. And so a lot of these girls who are transitioning aren't even trying to identify as a guy anymore. They're trying to identify as non-binary, which means neither one nor the other. Basically, I am opting out of this whole competition altogether. But like you said, there's no room for her to be a tomboy anymore. And so if you really think about it, these gender stereotypes try to get a person to conform their personality to match up with their body. So if your body's male, your personality's got to fit that. But gender theory commits the opposite fault of trying to get a person to conform their body to match their personality. So if your personality is more effeminate, then we need to make your body conform to that. And so neither one to me is really the right approach. I think the right approach is what one feminist author said, who was not Christian. She said, a woman is a person with a female body and any personality, not a female personality in any body.
So listen, just for the sake of also clarifying for some of our listeners and viewers, some of the misrepresentations that are often put forth of some of the research, because I think this is an easy place for people to kind of just feel like they're being crushed under the weight of what the supposed research says about all of this. Like, perhaps I'm even thinking, again, while acknowledging the obviously higher suicide rates among people who identify as trans, for example, the blackmail, the emotional blackmail that's done to parents that, wouldn't you rather have a living daughter than a dead son? Like this idea that somehow if you don't offer them this gender affirming care, you're going to be responsible for their death. That's often levied at people. People just feel, I think, paralyzed by what gets put forth. So maybe you can hit upon some of these things, like the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria and all these kinds of things that maybe our viewers and listeners might not be aware of.
Yeah, that suicide narrative, as you mentioned, is a particularly powerful one for parents who have a child distressed over their sense of gender, bring them to these clinics, and they basically will offer them, one idea that, okay, if your kid experiences gender dysphoria, it's because your kid is trans. And because your kid is trans, then there's really only one way pathway of intervention, which is to transition, and then everything's going to be fine. And if you don't go along with this, you're a transphobic parent. You could lose custody of your kid. Your kid's going to end up committing suicide. And it's like, well, wait, let's back this up. If there was this astronomical high rate of suicide before puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, then what we should see in the literature is this high morbidity, high suicidality, and then puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones became available, and the suicide rate dropped. What you see in the literature is the exact opposite of this, that they did have an elevated suicide rate, which is at about the same rate of people who struggle with the same comorbid psychological issues as those who have transgender inclinations, meaning most people who identify as trans, that is one point in a whole constellation of mental health challenges that they're wrestling with, from trauma, of sexual abuse, of divorce, of depression, anxiety. 42% are actually on the autistic spectrum who identify as trans, which is really interesting considering only 1% of the general population is. But if you take the people that have those comorbid experiences, their suicide rate is basically the same as those who identify as trans and have those things. But what we should see in the literature is this huge drop after we introduce puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. But what we see is the exact opposite. If you follow these individuals and give them puberty blockers, read the patient insert package on Lupron, which is the puberty blocker, and it actually says this will increase anxiety, irritability, suicidality, self-harm. So the kids are actually more likely to self-harm after going on puberty blockers than they were before getting the drug. This is why England, for one reason, banned puberty blockers for minors a couple of weeks ago. The biggest gender clinic in the United Kingdom was shut down just a couple of weeks ago as well. Amsterdam, Sweden, Finland, Norway, all these Scandinavian countries are backing out from this. They started it first, and they saw the data coming in is not positive. If you follow these individuals about 10 years after the operations, their suicide rate climbs to 19 times higher than the general population. If you isolate out female to male transitioners, suicide rate of more than 40 times as high as general population. And people say, well, that's because you transphobic religious bigots. That's not the full story. The full story is that 90% of people who commit suicide have a diagnosable mental health condition. And suicide or hormones and surgery are not the way to treat this. There's got to be a better pathway of intervention instead of flattening all these layers of human complexity into one layer of trans with one answer, transition. It didn't work in Western Europe, and that's why they're stopping it. And we need to catch up with the science.
And the truth that is frequently hidden, if not flatly denied, is that the course of drugs that gets pushed on these kids in the name of so-called gender-affirming care has devastating consequences, including permanent sterilization. And then on top of that, you've got now stories of detransitioners who are trying to say, hey, look, this was all pushed on me, and are now suing these doctors and medical facilities for doing what they did to them. So, I think that's all part of the mix. The stories of the detransitioners, I think, is going to be a game changer on this front.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the only game changer in my opinion, because, as you had mentioned, if you put a kid on puberty blockers and then they go right on from that to cross-sex hormones, which about 99% of them do, then the kid's sterilized for life. And at the age of 15 or 16, going through everything that they are, having a family is not really on the radar. But then they turn 24, 25 years old, their friends are getting married, having kids and breastfeeding, and they don't even have breasts anymore. It's like, wait a minute, what was I thinking? And then they look back, what were you adults thinking to let me go through that as a 16-year-old kid? I mean, they're performing bilateral mastectomies on 12-year-old girls at Oakland Children's Hospital, Los Angeles 13-year-old girls. Up in Oregon, age of medical consent is 15 years old. And the kids are raising money on stuff like GoFundMe.com to have double mastectomies. You go on GoFundMe.com, and type surgery. There's more than 40,000 girls and women there raising money to have their breasts surgically removed. But these are the same people, though, a couple years down the road, are suing the pants off of these clinics, and they're winning. And to me, that's eventually what's going to turn the tide. The question is how much carnage needs to happen before the tide shifts.
Talk a little bit about Lisa Littman and her discovery about rapid onset gender dysphoria, because I think that, Abigail Schreier has written a book about this phenomenon, and I think that it's a really important message for parents particularly to hear, but for people to know about.
Yeah, Abigail Schreier, the book that she wrote, Irreversible Damage, How the Transgender Craze is Seducing Our Daughters, is probably one of the best books I read on the whole subject of all the literature that I did. And in that book, she brings to light what Dr. Lisa Littman discovered. Now, Dr. Lisa Littman is not a conservative, right-wing Christian, activist. This is a woman who worked for Planned Parenthood, Democrat, pro-choice, you name it. And she started noticing in the literature this pattern of people who are identifying as trans non-binary. Historically, we've got more than 100 years of psychological literature showing the history of this. And it was predominantly gender dysphoria, something that impacted young boys and middle-aged men. And for the men, it was more of a fetish kind of thing, but it was predominantly the males. But what we saw in the last 15, 20 years was this massive flip of the sex ratio, where we had the skyrocketing level of predominantly adolescent girls who come from progressive families who spend an inordinate amount of time on social media, on TikTok, Tumblr, Instagram, YouTube, you name it. They maybe are at a public school and two of their friends come out as trans, then 3 or 4, then there's another one non-binary. There's a social contagion piece of it. And these girls did not have a pre-existing history of child gender dysphoria. It just started when they were like 13, 14, often tied on to sexual abuse or the over-sexual objectification of young girls, and many of them wanting to disguise the evidence of their own sexual maturation as a defense mechanism. Some who've suffered sexual abuse as a dissociative way to put their bodies away, the trauma away from themselves by dissociating themselves from that trauma, from dissociating from their own sexuality. And so she was noticing all these things, and she got crucified for this, among the left, basically fired, and just went through so much persecution. And she's like, look, I'm just showing what the literature says. You don't have this massive spike in middle-aged women identifying as non-binary or trans. Why is that not happening? Why are there these thousands more girls just suddenly showing up who don't think they're girls? What's the real core to this? And so she introduced this term rapid onset gender dysphoria, which doesn't explain everything, because there's plenty of people that might be like, look, I've been struggling with gender dysphoria for 40 years. That's before I even had a cell phone. It wasn't because I had progressive parents. It wasn't because of this or that. And you can't take a cookie cutter approach for this to everybody. But ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria, is showing a very clear pattern of social contagion, predominantly among adolescent females falling into this ideology.
And I think that some of the relationship was made to like anorexia and bulimia and eating disorders of times past, correct?
Yeah. These were other social contagions that kind of swept through adolescent cultures. The eating disorders, cutting, even stuff like golf. I mean, these things kind of sweep in and they kind of sweep out, unfortunately taking a lot of people with them in one way or another. But I've seen this through 26 years of speaking in the high schools. I remember going, years and years ago, there's so much the eating disorder, and then that kind of faded away. And then all these girls were cutting and self-harming. And then that thing kind of went away. And then now this, and God willing, it won't be too long before this dissipates, before more harm is caused.
So with all that said, let's turn to the topic of ministering to people with gender dysphoria. And in fact, I do appreciate that you even touch upon things like, for example, do you call somebody a trans person versus somebody who identifies as trans? Or, I think there's one quote in the book where you say you approach this question a lot differently when you think you're dealing with trans kids as opposed to kids with gender dysphoria. But nevertheless, you've got to be pastorally sensitive. These kids are confused. They're being bombarded with all kinds of things going on in their lives. Certainly, they're getting all sorts of messages coming at them. And so you want to have a charitable approach to them. You want to be able to reach out to them. You want to have compassion on their circumstance, but you also want to tell them the truth, because only the truth is going to really be the thing that helps them. So how do you balance that? How do you minister to them with the truth of God's plan for them and their bodies, and yet do that in a way that is pastorally sensitive and draws them into to relationship,
Yeah, well, I'd say step one is don't try to win the debate in the first discussion you have with them on this of like, I've got this great ammo on chromosomes and this and that, I'm going to fire off at you. No, listen. Thank them. Thank you for sharing that with me. I bet that was really hard to tell me that, because you might have been afraid that I was going to reject you or make fun of you or tell you it's just a phase. Tell me more about this. Like, when did you start feeling that way? Or what kind of triggers that dysphoria? Or where have you learned about this? And you really start asking questions, because you want to build that relationship, because you objectively care about them and you want them to know that you're safe to come to. And that as time goes on, you can start to challenge some of these transgender assumptions, these philosophies that lie underneath it. But the first step is to be the ears of Christ and the eyes of Christ, not just his mouth, and trying to win some kind of debate, and helping to ask thoughtful questions. When did this start occurring in your life? When did you start feeling this way? And sometimes they try to retroactively look at history through this lens of gender, like, oh, I always felt this way. And they kind of interpret experiences they had in third or second grade as, hey, maybe that was a sign that I was trans. But we're not trying to...
And unfortunately, sometimes therapists encourage them to do that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Look at all these markers throughout your life that this is truly who you are. But our goal here is not to debate memories. Our goal here is to to build this relationship. I remember a couple girls coming up to me at a junior high in Dallas. It was about 7 or so junior high girls came up to me, all in the 7th grade, all identifying as lesbian. And I started talking to the girls and, ask them questions. And it turns out they were not erotically attracted to the 8th grade girls. They just thought the 8th grade boys were disgusting, which of course we know they are. And so conclusion that they arrived at is because these boys just objectify us in such a degrading way. And the ideas they have of human sexuality that I've seen on their cell phones that they've sent to me is so appalling and violating. I would never want to be a part of that. But yet I long for intimacy. I long for a relationship where I'm safe from objectification, where I can emotionally connect to someone on a mature level. And hey, shocker, I can't find that with an 8th grade boy. But guess what? I sure am finding with these 8th grade girls. Maybe I am lesbian. Maybe that's my identity. And so what we've got to do is kind of affirm the ache they have and make sure they're not replacing their whole story with a label. LT. Like, no. There's more than just the title. Let's listen to the story. I remember one girl tell me, she's like, yeah, I told my mom I was non-binary, and she freaked out at me, and she was screaming at me, and I just ran out of my room and slammed my door. I said, okay, we're going to have this conversation again. I'm going to be your mom. You're going to be you, okay? And you have to tell me that you're non-binary, but you're not allowed to say the word non-binary. Now go. And she's like, okay, well, I feel like sometimes I want to do what guys do. And I sometimes I don't want to have to fit into what all the girls like to do and what they want to talk about. I'm like, okay, keep going. And everything she said, her mother would have affirmed. But as soon as she kind of camped out on that word non-binary, this is what I am, not a girl, there was no progress in the conversation after that. And so I said, let's speak from the experience rather than this title that your mom might not understand, because then you're just going to get a debate about that. Let's talk about the bigger picture here. But then the parents, obviously it's tough. I mean, you got to really be aware of, is my kid living on social media and TikTok, imbibing all of these ideas because they're not getting outside and playing with their siblings? So it's obviously a complex issue, but let's begin with being the eyes and the ears of Christ before just being his mouth.
No, and that's a great point. I appreciate that very much. What would you say to parents who maybe feel paralyzed? I mean, like you mentioned before, there's this fear now in the culture that if they don't affirm that the kid might be taken from them, mm-hmm. That if they don't go ahead with certain gender treatment and whether that be psychological treatment, medical treatment, et cetera, that their kids are going to be taken from them. And yet they don't want to, they don't really believe that that's what their child is really struggling with. And so there has to be like this compassion, but there also needs to be courage. And that's really tough when you feel like you're the one who's being told is the hater, the bigot, mm-hmm. the one who's not supportive, not loving, etc. So what would your words be to those parents who are struggling in that way?
Well, one, to realize this is not conspiracy, fringe theory, internet stuff. This is happening. I mean, there was a Catholic couple in Indiana just recently lost custody of their child over this issue. And the judge even said in the case, there is no neglect, there's no abuse going on, but we still need to remove your child from your custody because you won't affirm their gender identity by using their preferred pronouns. Catholic family, no abuse, no neglect, but not caving in on gender theory, lost custody of their own kid. And so this is heartbreaking stuff. So first thing, we got to get our heads out of the sand. Okay, is my kid in a public school where they're getting taught this stuff, or even in some Catholic schools? And if so, maybe the solution is get the kid out of the school. Maybe we need to move. I mean, some families have gone to that extent and said that was the difference. We just had to get out of that toxic environment that we were in. Other times they can stay put, and work through things, but you want to try to unplug your kid as much as you can from social media, spend more time as a family, especially outdoors, family dinners, things like that, and really take seriously this concern. Okay, I hear what you're saying. I know this isn't very important to you. I'm not going to make fun of this. We're going to walk through this together, because about 80% of the time when a child experiences gender dysphoria, they will come to naturally identify with their biological sex by the end of puberty. So typically childhood dysphoria, when left on its own, will just resolve. The problem is when we're getting these outside influences of the public school, alliance groups. You've got the stuff going on TikTok and Instagram. That kind of reinforces the dysphoria that they're feeling. It's not really affirming the kid. It's actually affirming the dysphoria. When it's the parents that are trying to affirm the kid, and realize the dysphoria is real, but it's not our job to collaborate with the mental illness. It's our job to treat it.
So if you were to say, you already said a do listen, don't like immediately try to win an argument. If you were to offer just a few more do's and don'ts, for people who are either working in ministry or to parents, what would those be? Just a few key ones you think would be really important.
Well, I was speaking with a woman who is a detransitioner recently, went through puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, had double mastectomy. Now she's 19 years old. And I asked her, what advice would you give to parents, who have a kid that's identifying as trans? And she said, under no circumstances should you use their preferred pronoun. She said, because they look to you as this arbiter of truth and reality. And once you start entertaining their delusion out of fear, then you have just endorsed their entire mindset that they will forever be not at home in their own body until they change it. And so she said, don't go down that road. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to force the correct pronoun on them. No, he. Maybe back off for a while. Okay, I'm not going to force it. I'm not going to entertain the wrong, pronoun. But maybe we can find some alternative route to go around this. So we're trying to avoid it. If it really comes to a head, you could say, look, I love you and I care about you. I know this is very important to you. But you also know, because I love you, I can't lie to you. And I feel like if I were to use the word for you, I'd feel like I'm being dishonest with you. And I don't reject you because of what you believe on this. You know that I love you. But I hope you don't reject me as well, because my viewpoint is different. So I think we can still learn a lot from each other if we made room for each other in our lives. And I think if you take that more loving approach, hopefully they'll cut you some slack. I know one boy, aunt was telling me, she said, yeah, my nephew came out to the whole family is trans, and this aunt had a real tight relationship with the boy. And she said, just so you know, I'm still calling you Donnie. I'm not changing your name. And this boy who wanted to identify as female was like, well, okay, because you're Aunt so-and-so, I'll let you have a pass. And so he gave her a pass because he was so convinced of her love for him. And so that's what we need to focus on. Just keep pouring in that love. Dive into resources. If you go to our website, chastity.com/gender, we've got tons of information on this stuff. We've got tons of podcasts, books, resources that parents can use, parent advocacy groups, legal groups that you can tap into to defend your rights as parents. All that at chastity.com/gender.
Fantastic. Listen, Jason, this has been a fantastic interview. I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. I'm thankful that you came on to talk with us. This is such an important message for people today to hear. I am totally grateful for your work, for being here, and for your courage, because this is something that takes a lot of courage in this day of cancellation, in this day and age of cancellation. And obviously, you're providing for a family through your apostolate. There's got to be a little bit of fear, I'm sure, even in the heart of Jason Evert from time to time. So I'm grateful that you have that courage, and I appreciate that very much. So,
well, thank you. I just ask your prayers for our ministry, all the young people we speak to, our family, because if any conversions are happening, it's not because of eloquence or good books. It's because of the grace that's behind that. So I just ask everybody's prayers.
Amen. God bless you, Jason.
You too.
Good to have
you.
you. Bye-bye.
We're so glad that you joined us today. I want to remind you, please share this podcast with as many people as possible. The more people that hear it, the more people that our Lord can heal and save. Stay connected by following us on your favorite social media platform at R4H Podcast. That is the letter R, the number 4, and the letter H Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on our YouTube channel. Remember, in a world where things can get dark, Christ is the light. There's always a reason for hope. This is Mario Costabile. Until next time, peace.